Welcome to this trip through one of the scariest cases in Appalachian history. In the comments, let me know where you're watching from before we start. Today, we'll talk about what happened in the dark woods of North Carolina in the late 1800s. At that time, small towns were cut off from the rest of the world, which made them safe places where secrets could stay hidden forever. It's 1899 autumn. The Appalachians protect towns that have been forgotten by time in a quiet way. That was when western North Carolina was. A tough-to-reach area with winding dirt roads that went between misty hills and deep valleys where the forest floor rarely saw the sun. Families lived far apart, separated by miles of muddy trails. To talk to other villages, messengers on horses or wagons had to travel long lengths that seem small now. It was known back then for being harshly alone and having beautiful, wild scenery. Whole towns were buried under mounds of snow when winter came early and stayed late. That meant every trip was a risk of death. Family names were passed down from generation to generation, and people knew each other by them. The police were not very close, and it could take weeks for them to show up when they were needed. Grace Hargrove, who was 28 years old, had moved to a small farm near the town of Valor Cruz, whose name in Latin meant Valley of the Cross. She moved to the area 3 years ago from the hills in eastern North Carolina. Grace knew a lot about medicine because she had a reputation for being a skilled healer. He knew plants better than anyone else and quickly became someone people who didn't have access to doctors wanted to see. She made tinctures to treat fevers, poultices to treat cuts with infections, and teas to ease pains that modern medicine doesn't fully understand. But Grace knew more than just about herbs. Even when she smiled, her dark eyes showed sadness. There was a heavy silence around her. The people who lived closest to her, about 3 miles away, said she didn't talk much about her past. When asked, she answered calmly but strongly, changed the subject. There were rumors going around at the small wooden church in the area on Sundays about her personal past, which was unknown to most people. Early in October 1899, Thomas Whitaker, a farmer going to the mill who had been through Grace's land, saw her last. He later told the sheriff of the county that she looked tense and kept looking at the trees around her house. To Thomas's question, "Is everything okay?" Grace only said that she had felt strange beings around her land this last few nights. The comment didn't bother Whitaker at the time. She thought it was just the nerves of a woman living alone in such a remote place. 3 days later, when Grace didn't show up for a meeting to bring medicine to the Patterson family's sick child, people started to worry. Grace was known for being on time and dedicated, especially when things needed to be done right away. Mrs. Patterson sent her husband to see what was going on at Grace's house. Things that Joshua Patterson, he met on that gray October afternoon, would stick with him forever. The house door was open and swaying a little because of the cold wind coming down from the mountains. There were signs of bad things happening inside the house. There were marks on the floor that looked like they were from a fight, and furniture was flipped over and medicine bottles were broken. But Grace Hargrove was gone. It looked like the ground had opened up and eaten her up. Patterson ran back to the village, and soon a group of men got together to look for the healer who had gone missing. They looked through the nearby woods, followed trails to the highest peaks, and went down to the valley's icy streams. There are no signs of where Grace may have gone or been taken. It looked like she had no longer existed. Police from Whatcom County, led by William McBride, went to the house 2 days after the person went missing. McBride had been in the Civil War and was used to acting in tough situations, but even he was. What he found made him feel bad. There were clear signs of a fight, but there was something more disturbing. There were little things that didn't make sense at first but seemed to be screaming a secret truth. Sheriff McBride found a worn-out leather-bound book on the kitchen table. It was open to a page from 2 days before she went missing. The words there showed that fear was growing. Grace wrote about the shadows she saw in the trees at dusk, the sound of footsteps around her house at night, and the feeling that she was always being watched, looked at. She said she recognized someone close, but the name was crossed out so many times that the paper tore. One of the most interesting things about the case would turn out to be this intentional omission. In addition, McBride saw that some of Grace's personal items were still there. In the closet, her clothes were neatly folded. Under the bed, her savings were hidden in a cookie tin, and her work tools were set up on the shelves. The person who broke into the house wasn't trying to steal anything. What they wanted to do was something else, something more personal and dark. For the next few days, the sheriff talked to everyone who knew Grace Hargrove. This is how the first inconsistencies came about. Some people who lived there said that Grace was a nice and quiet woman, but some people whispered different stories. They talked about people coming and going at night, tense conversations that could be heard through the windows, and a tall man who had been seen leaving her land early in the morning more than once. The person who was this strange guest became the investigation's main point. The descriptions were very different. Some people said he dressed like a city gentleman. Others were sure they saw a man dressed in simple farm clothes. Some said he rode a black horse, while others said he rode in a quiet carriage. It sounded like more than one person was being talked about, or like bystanders were trying to hide the truth. In the middle of October, the local newspaper, the Watauga Democrat, wrote a small story about the disappearance. The piece was careful and talked about Grace as a respected resident whose sudden absence is causing problems in the community. But stories were going around behind the scenes that were much more scary. Some mean people started to say that Grace was hiding a scandalous past and that she might have moved to the mountains to get away from something or someone. McBride didn't usually believe stories, but he knew that in this case, where there wasn't much proof, even the craziest rumors were worth hearing. He wrote telegrams to sheriffs in nearby counties and even to people in charge in eastern North Carolina, which is where Grace was born and raised. As more answers came in, they painted a picture that became more complicated. Her real name wasn't Grace Hargrove. She was born in New Bern in 1871 as Grace Thornton into a good business family. She got married to Daniel Hargrove in 1893. He was a good lawyer with important political ties. Official papers say that the marriage ended quickly in 1896, but they don't give many other details. It wasn't written down anywhere. At the time, divorce was very uncommon, especially among people with a lot of money and power. What was even more interesting was that Daniel Hargrove had vanished from public view at the same time. His New Bern law business was suddenly shut down, his house was quickly sold, and he stopped being seen in the professional and social circles he used to be a part of. People he worked with and friends knew he had left for better chances in the West, but no one could say for sure where. When McBride. When this knowledge was shared with some of Grace's oldest neighbors, their responses were telling. Mrs. Martha Calloway, who lived nearby and had become friendly with Grace in a cautious way, said that the herbalist had once talked about ending a difficult part of her life. Grace told him she needed to start over somewhere no one knew her name or story, and she could just be herself. But it was clear that Grace Hargrove hadn't found peace in the Wata, hilly areas. McBride read and reread her diary many times, and the last lines talked about growing fear. Grace wrote that he had found her and wouldn't leave her alone. She also said that he had come to get something from her that she thought she had hidden in the past. The words weren't very clear, but the feeling was clear. Fear filled every hurried word. The investigation got even more sinister when McBride chose to look more closely at the area around the property. About 200 yards from the house, he followed a barely visible path into a deeper part of the forest and saw evidence that someone had just camped there. There were signs of fire. Twigs arranged to make a makeshift shelter, and, most disturbingly, a spot where they could see Grace's kitchen window. Someone had been there for a long time, watching the house and studying how it moved while waiting for the right time. McBride found pieces of partly burned paper in the ashes of the fire. With care, he was able to keep some pieces that can be read. The handwriting on the letters was polite and male. The parts that made it through the fire had lines that were full of mixed feelings. One line said, "You can't just disappear and expect me to accept it." Another said, "What we did needs to be resolved, Grace. There's no running from it forever." The fire destroyed the signature completely. The sheriff sent the pieces to Raleigh, the state capital, for analysis, but had no idea how long it would take. Meanwhile, he kept looking for people who might have seen something important. That's when he met Elijah Stone, a lone hunter who lived in an even more remote, basic cabin in the mountains about 6 miles from Valor Cruz. Stone was known for being quiet and having a deep understanding of the trails and forests. At first, he didn't want to talk to the police, but McBride kept pushing him until Stone finally admitted to seeing something strange on the night of October 7th, the night Grace was last seen. Stone was coming back from a hunt when he saw the light of a flashlight moving through the trees down one of the steepest valleys in the area. What caught his eye was the time. It was after midnight, and the way the light moved, it looked like the person carrying it was in a hurry or having trouble. Stone hadn't looked into it because people in that area learned not to get involved in other people's business. Because of how important Grace's disappearance was to him, he agreed to take McBride to the general area where he'd seen the light. It was a very dangerous area, with deep ravines and loose rocks that made going down even during the day dangerous. He led 2 full expeditions with volunteers from the village to search the valley. On the 3rd day of searching, they found her body at a spot where a stream formed a small waterfall. It was very scary for everyone. There were pieces of fabric on the stream bank that matched the dress Grace was wearing when Thomas Whitaker last saw her. The fabric was torn and looked like it had been ripped off violently, and there were mud and scratch marks that suggested a struggle or a violent fall. McBride ordered the search to go further downstream, following the river for miles. The rapids were strong that time of year because it rained a lot in the mountains in the fall. The search team worked hard for another week, but all they found were a few scattered personal items, including a silver brooch that Mrs. Calloway confirmed belonged to Grace and a muddy shoe found nearly 2 miles downstream. While the physical searches went on, McBride did more research into Grace's past by traveling to New Bern, which took him several days and took him across the state. In the coastal town, he talked to people about his findings. People who knew Grace and Daniel Hargrove during their short marriage. These conversations painted a picture of a relationship that started out well, but quickly went bad. Daniel Hargrove was described as ambitious and charismatic, but his moods were mostly unstable in private. There were rumors of heated arguments coming from the couple's home and of Grace being seen with tears in her eyes at social events, slowly becoming alone as the marriage went on. A former housekeeper who now works for another family told McBride that she had seen moments of intense tension between the couple, including talks about secrets Daniel insisted on keeping hidden. The lawyer who had handled the legal matters related to the couple's separation or whatever had happened between them had already died. His records, according to the successor firm, had been destroyed in a suspicious fire in 1897, which was too convenient to be a coincidence. McBride thought the search for Daniel Hargrove was just as important as the search for Grace. He sent telegrams to dozens of counties describing the man based on the information he had gathered. Daniel was said to be about 35 years old in 1899, taller than average, with dark hair starting to gray at the temples and the manners of a polite man. But weeks went by with no solid leads on where he was. Then he got an unexpected reply from a Burke County is between New Bern and Wata. In the summer of 1899, a man who looked like Daniel Harrow was seen in Morganton, which was the county seat. He stayed at a simple hotel for 3 weeks under the name David Harrison. The hotel manager remembered him because the guest had asked specific questions about routes to the western mountains, especially those leading to Watauga County. He also asked about women living alone in the area, saying he was looking for them. This information confirmed what McBride already thought. Daniel Hargrove, or whoever that man was looking for Grace. He had approached carefully, checking out where she was before making any direct moves. The sheriff was asked a simple but important question. What was the ultimate goal of this search? Was it reconciliation? A reckoning? Something even worse? Back in Valor Cruz, people were torn between caring about Grace and having growing doubts about what she might have been up to. Reverend Pastor Edmund Cole of the local church approached McBride with information he thought was important. Cole told McBride that Grace had sought spiritual advice from him a few months before she went missing. She didn't give him specifics, but she did talk about the guilt she felt, the decisions she made in the past that haunted her, and the fear that her mistakes would catch up with her. The Reverend didn't say more because he wanted to protect the privacy of his pastoral conversations. Cole thought Grace was really upset because she had said she was thinking about leaving the area again and going somewhere even farther away, like Tennessee or the far western territories. He tried to reassure her that the past could be forgotten with faith and time, but Grace told him that some pasts just couldn't be forgotten. In the meantime, the search for Grace continued at times. Smaller groups of volunteers were still going through the forests and checking out natural caves that were common in the area, Appalachian limestone region, and looking into barns and abandoned buildings. As winter arrived in November, these trips became more dangerous. Snow started to cover the highest peaks, and temperatures dropped. McBride knew that Grace's chances of survival were significantly decreasing with each passing day if she were injured somewhere in the mountains. In December 1899, a strange event gave the investigation new life. Carolina went to the sheriff's office with an interesting story. He said he had seen a woman who looked like Grace Hargrove in the town of Asheville, which is about 40 miles south of Watauga, in late October. The woman was with a tall, well-dressed man, and the two seemed to be arguing very loudly on one of the town's less busy streets. The shopkeeper hadn't gone over because the scene seemed private and maybe dangerous, but he had noticed that the woman seemed. The man held her arm tightly, and when the shopkeeper looked again a short time later, they were both gone. It wasn't until weeks later that he made the connection to Grace's case when he saw a poster with her description in a Boone store. McBride went to Asheville to look into it in person. The town was much bigger than V. Cruz, with hotels, bed and breakfasts, and a train station connecting the area to the rest of the state and beyond. He spent days giving descriptions of Grace, and some people thought they recognized the woman, but no one could be sure because memories were fuzzy and descriptions were too general. What McBride found in Asheville, however, was another piece of the puzzle. On October 24th, he found an entry in the records of a hotel near the train station. It was for a couple registered as Mr. and Mrs. Harrison, but they didn't give their permanent address. They had only stayed one night and left the next morning on a train going south too. The bellhop who had helped them had moved to a different city, so the possibility that Grace was still alive, though in a bad way, sparked a new round of investigations. McBride called the authorities in Georgia and asked them to look at records of hotels and boarding houses along the rail route from Asheville. But Georgia was huge, and they didn't have any more specific information, so it was like looking for a needle in a haystack to find two people. The sheriff looked at something he had missed at first, the medicines and preparations Grace kept in her cabin. He called an apothecary from Boone, the nearest big city, to look at the bottles and jars he found on the property. The apothecary, Herbert Sinclair, was known for knowing a lot about both common and unusual medicines. Sinclair spent 2 days listing and studying Grace's preparations. Most of them were exactly what he thought they were. What you'd expect from a good herbalist: tinctures for fevers, salves for burns, digestive teas, and anti-inflammatory patches. But there were a few vials that really interested the apothecary. They contained plant-based preparations that, while not illegal, were known for their effects beyond just being medicinal. There were extracts that in high doses could put people to sleep, concoctions that could make them temporarily lose their way, and a particularly interesting mix that Sinclair knew was being used. When asked what these substances were for, Sinclair was cautious. He said that experienced herbalists often kept these kinds of preparations for real medical emergencies. The extract that put people to sleep could be life-saving for people in unbearable pain, and disorienting agents were used in some procedures. But he also said that these kinds of substances could be dangerous in the wrong hands or with shady intentions. McBride asked if Grace could have used these kinds of preparations. Sinclair said it was possible, but it was also dangerous because doses had to be exact, and effects were very different from person to person. If you made a mistake, it could have bad results. There was also the question of why a herbalist would keep such substances in larger amounts than needed for occasional use. Some of the vials were almost full, which suggested they had just been made or weren't used very often. This discovery started a whole new line of inquiry. McBride started to wonder if Grace was simply running from a threatening past, or if she herself had something to hide, something that justified keeping potentially dangerous substances. He examined her diary again, this time looking for references to her herbal knowledge that might have darker connotations. In a June 1899 entry, Grace had written about being approached by a woman from a distant village who needed help with a delicate problem. Grace had not specified the nature of the problem, but had mentioned providing the usual concoction for such situations. The language was deliberately vague, but McBride, experienced man that he was, understood the implication. In isolated rural communities where doctors were scarce and social judgments were harsh, certain solutions to certain problems were sought discreetly. This didn't necessarily make Grace a criminal. The laws on such matters were complex and varied, and proving specific intent or conduct would be extremely difficult, but it did reveal that Grace operated in a gray area, providing services that some people would think it was wrong, while others would think it was necessary. It also meant that she knew about and had access to substances that could theoretically be used for purposes other than medicine. McBride wondered if Daniel Hargrove knew about this part of Grace's work. Maybe this was the secret he insisted on keeping, as the pieces of burned letters suggested. Or maybe there was something deeper, something about their marriage that they both held on to and couldn't let go of. The mountains had very bad winters from 1899 to 1900. It snowed a lot and stayed below freezing for weeks at a time. The official search for Grace stopped until spring, when the thaw made it safe to go back to exploring the more remote areas. McBride kept the investigation going on paper, but he knew that the chances of finding Grace alive were decreasing every day. In February 1900, a letter came from a sheriff in Fulton County, Georgia, which is home to Atlanta. That a woman matching Grace Hargrove's description had been seen in the city in early November, but not accompanied by a man. She had been noticed because she had been seeking work as a housekeeper in several homes using the name Margaret Thornton. The sheriff had enclosed descriptions provided by 2 families who had interviewed her. The details matched remarkably well. Her height, her eye color, the birthmark Grace had on her left wrist. The news from Atlanta injected new energy into the investigation, but it also raised more. There were more questions than answers. If the woman in Atlanta really was Grace Hargrove, what happened between her likely forced departure from Valor Cruise and her appearance alone in Georgia's capital. And most importantly, where was the man that witnesses said she was with in Asheville? McBride knew he had to go to Atlanta himself, but the mountains were still too snowy for him to make the trip until March, when the roads could be used again. He wanted to learn more about Grace and Daniel Hargrove's relationship, so he sent detailed letters to lawyers, judges, and officials in New Bern and nearby towns, asking for any records, no matter how small, that were related to the couple. Most of the responses were disappointing, either repeating information he already knew or saying the records were lost or destroyed. But one letter from a retired lawyer named Chester Baldwin revealed some disturbing facts. Baldwin worked next door to Daniel Hargrove in New Bern and wrote that Daniel was a smart and skilled lawyer who was obsessed with his status and reputation. He felt like he had to control his public image and the people around him all the time. Many people saw his marriage to Grace Thornton as a smart move because the Thornton family had important business connections. But what started out as an easy union quickly turned into something more complicated and tense. Baldwin described seeing Daniel's problems, a disturbing scene one summer afternoon in 1895. He was leaving his office when he heard raised voices coming from Daniel's office. He immediately recognized Grace's voice, thick with desperation and determination. She was saying something about not being able to live with this lie any longer and that the truth must come out. Daniel had responded in a low but menacing voice, words Baldwin couldn't quite make out, but whose tone was unmistakably intimidating. When Grace emerged from the office moments later, her eyes were. Baldwin never found out what they were arguing about, but over the next few months he noticed big changes in both of them. Daniel became even more shy and irritable, started having affairs, and pulled away from social groups he had once actively pursued. Grace, on the other hand, seemed to wither, losing weight and energy. The few times Baldwin saw her at public events, she looked like a shadow of the lively woman he knew when they were married. Talked about a rumor that had been going around among New Bern lawyers. Some thought Daniel had been involved in problems with a high-profile case he had defended in 1894. In that case, a merchant was accused of committing substantial fraud against investors. Daniel had argued brilliantly to get his client acquitted, but there were rumors that important evidence had mysteriously disappeared from the court records. Nothing had been proven, and no formal charges had been brought. The case was filed, but the suspicion remained a small stain on his reputation. Baldwin hinted in the letter that Grace might have learned something about her husband's shady behavior. Maybe she had seen him destroy documents, change evidence, or even pay witnesses to lie. If so, she would be in a tough spot. If she told anyone about her husband's bad behavior, she would lose her job and her reputation. But if she kept quiet, she would be seen as a coward. McBride thought this theory made a lot of sense. It would explain why the couple broke up so quickly, why Grace had to disappear and start over with a new name, and why Daniel was so determined to find her. If Grace knew about Daniel's criminal activities, she was always a threat because she could reveal what she knew at any time as long as she was alive and free. For a man as focused on control and reputation as Daniel, this was a huge problem. Hargrove, this would not be acceptable. McBride also thought about a darker possibility. What if Grace wasn't an innocent victim, but an active participant in Daniel's schemes? What if she had helped with the fraud? Maybe by forging documents or using her persuasive skills to trick witnesses. In this case, the couple might have broken up over money from the illegal activities or because they felt betrayed by each other. Grace's escape to the mountains would have been not only she wanted to get away from her controlling husband and possible legal problems. The sheriff knew he was guessing and building castles of possibilities on foundations of broken evidence. But in investigations like this, where witnesses were few and documents were easy to find, Informed guessing was a useful tool. It was important to think of different possible outcomes and then look for evidence to support or disprove them. In March 1900, McBride started the long trip to Atlanta as soon as roads allowed. It took him almost a year, week traveling by train, wagon, and horseback. Georgia's capital was a completely different world from the silent Watauga Mountains. Atlanta bustled with activity, rebuilt from the ashes of the Civil War and rapidly growing as the commercial and industrial center of the South. The Fulton County Sheriff, a young and efficient man named Thomas Whitmore, received McBride with professional courtesy. He had already done some preliminary work locating the two families who had interviewed the woman named Margaret Thornton. McBride. After visiting both homes and talking with the women who had interviewed the housekeepers, a consistent and detailed description of the woman emerged. The woman seemed to be in her 30s, was polite and articulate, and knew how to run a household and give basic medical care. She said she had worked for families in eastern North Carolina before, but she wasn't specific about dates or names of employers. When asked for references, she said that her former employers had moved out of state and would be difficult to contact quickly. What intrigued McBride most was a specific detail mentioned by one of the women. She had noticed that the candidate wore gloves throughout the interview, even inside the heated house, claiming to have sensitive hands due to frequent work with cleaning agents. When the woman casually mentioned this, the woman became visibly uncomfortable and quickly changed the subject. McBride knew Grace had distinctive marks on her. The woman's hands had small burn scars from years of working with herbal mixtures over fire. Were these the marks she was trying to hide? What was even more telling was that the woman hadn't accepted any of the job offers. She said she needed time to think about them and promised to come back in a few days, but she never did. Her family thought she'd found a better job somewhere else, which was common in the city's booming economy where jobs were plentiful. But to McBride, this behavior suggested that she wasn't interested in the jobs. Sheriff Whitmore and McBride looked through records from the woman's time in Atlanta's hotels and boarding houses. They found a Margaret Thornton registered at a simple boarding house near the business district, where she had stayed for 8 days in early November. The boarding house owner, a smart widow named Mrs. Eugenia Porter, remembered her guest well. A quiet woman who mostly stayed in her room and only came out to get simple meals or go for short walks around the neighborhood, Mrs. Porter said something that caught McBride's attention. Mrs. Porter had noticed that the guest seemed to be watching the street outside her bedroom window with extra attention on 2 occasions, as if she was hoping or afraid to see a certain person. For example, when a tall man in a dark overcoat walked by the guest house, the guest suddenly stepped back from the street window as if to avoid being seen. The owner at the time found this behavior strange, but did not interfere, respecting her guest's privacy. When the woman had left the boarding house, she had left the room impeccably clean and paid her bill in full without indicating where she was going. Mrs. Porter had noticed, however, that she carried only a small suitcase, insufficient for someone planning to settle permanently in a new place. It was the luggage of someone in transit, someone who didn't intend to stay. McBride spent 3 more days in Atlanta, showing descriptions of Grace and Daniel at train stations, stagecoach offices, and other places where travelers often went. Some clerks thought they recognized the woman's description, but no one could say for sure what happened to her after she left the boarding house. As for Daniel Hargrove, no one recognized him at all. If he had been in Atlanta, he had been quiet enough to leave no obvious sign. The big question remained, what had happened between Grace and Daniel? It was likely that Grace was forced to leave Valor Custis and show up alone in Atlanta. If she had been taken by Daniel from Asheville to Georgia, as the hotel record suggested, why was she there by herself weeks later? Had she escaped? Had he let her go for some reason? Or had something more sinister happened along the way, leaving only Grace free to continue? McBride thought that Daniel Hargrove might be dead. Maybe Grace, feeling trapped and desperate, had used her to get away. She had access to substances that could kill in large amounts. If Daniel had made her travel with him against her will, and if she had found the chance to do so while they were on the trip, would she have gone to great lengths to get away? This theory would explain a lot of things, including Daniel's disappearance from public records, Grace's apparent freedom in Atlanta, her cautious behavior, and her choice not to stay in one place. Long story short, it raised a lot of legal and moral questions. If Grace had killed Daniel, even in self-defense, she would still be a criminal. And if it wasn't self-defense but planned, then McBride wasn't looking for a victim, but a suspect. When the sheriff returned to Watauga in April 1900, he had more questions than answers. He wrote a detailed report of what he had found and sent it to police in several states, asking them to let him know about any sightings of women. He also used county money to hire a private investigator in Atlanta to keep an eye on the arrivals and departures of people who might be Grace. Back in Val Cruz's, Grace's property was left empty and slowly giving way to the elements. The plants in her medicinal garden had grown wild, encroaching on the well-kept beds she had so carefully tended. Neighbors said the house seemed haunted, but not by ghosts, but by the lingering presence of unanswered questions. People didn't go there at night because they were afraid of the mysteries the cabin held. McBride went back to the site several times in the spring and summer to look for anything he might have missed on the first searches. It was during one of these visits in June 1900 that he made a discovery that would change the whole case. He was looking at a small outbuilding that Grace had used to store her dried herbs and tools when he noticed that some floorboards looked like they had been cut. The boards had just been carefully taken off and put back on, leaving faint but clear tool marks. McBride carefully removed the boards and found a hollow space below. Inside was a carefully sealed metal can. As he opened it, his heart raced. Inside was a sheath of letters tied with faded ribbon, a small ledger with coded entries he couldn't immediately decipher, and, most shockingly, a small, loaded pistol of modest caliber. There was also a photograph of Grace and Daniel on what looked like their wedding day. There was no sign of the bad things that were to come in the letters McBride found hidden under the floorboards. They showed parts of Grace and Daniel's relationship that no witness had mentioned. Written over 3 years, from 1893 to 1896, they showed how the marriage slowly fell apart, starting out with real promise but quickly becoming an emotional prison for Grace. Daniel's first letters, written while on a business trip to Charleston, were passionate and angry. Early letters were thoughtful, full of promises of a shared future and expressions of love, but there were also subtle hints of possessiveness that suggested he saw Grace more as property than as a partner. Daniel's later letters took on a very different tone. He wrote with growing paranoia about his reputation, about enemies supposedly plotting to destroy him, and about Grace's need to keep secrets that he never fully explained in his letters. He made veiled references to the matter we talked about. This was a very scary letter from Daniel in March 1895. He said, "Grace is the only person who could ruin me completely, so I must be absolutely certain of your loyalty." The threat was clear, but it was Grace's letters that really scared McBride. She had never sent them. She had kept them hidden, maybe to work through her feelings or as proof in case she ever had to defend herself. In them, Grace talked about how she felt about Daniel. A terrible discovery she made in the summer of 1894. She found papers in Daniel's private office at his home that showed he was involved in a fraud scheme involving fake land titles. Daniel wasn't just defending criminals. He was a criminal himself, making up evidence and bribing witnesses to protect wealthy clients and getting very rich in the process. Grace wrote that she had told Daniel about the discoveries and was hoping for a reasonable explanation. He told Grace everything he did without feeling bad about it, saying that it was necessary in a world where only smart people could succeed. When Grace threatened to expose him, Daniel changed completely. He became cold and calculating, explaining in detail how his downfall would also mean hers. He made sure to involve her in some transactions, forging her signature on documents to create a paper trail that would suggest she was involved. If she exposed him, he made sure she would be in deep trouble. But Grace's news was even scarier. In a letter from September 1895, she wrote about an event that had really scared her. Daniel had brought home a man he called the associate, who was obviously involved in his illegal activities. Grace said she had heard the two men talking about how to get rid of trouble with a witness who was going to tell the police. She hadn't heard the whole conversation, but she did get a sense of what they were saying. The tone of the conversation made it clear that they weren't talking about legal inducement or bribery. They were talking about permanently silencing someone. Weeks after this conversation, Grace read in the newspaper that a businessman who had been involved in the fraud case Daniel was working on had gone missing. The man was never found, and the case was eventually closed for lack of evidence. Grace wrote that she had been sick for days, tormented by the thought that her husband might have been involved. She started making plans to escape right away, but it would take her months to get the courage and money she needed. The ledger that was found in the hiding place was full of numbers and codes that didn't make sense at first. But McBride was very careful, and he spent days going through the entries and looking for patterns. Eventually, he figured out how the system worked. Grace was writing down Daniel's financial transactions that she had found, tracking money flows that clearly didn't go with his legal practice. There were records of large payments from unknown sources, transfers to accounts in different cities, and amounts going missing without a clear explanation. The most telling entries were from the last few months of 1895 and the beginning of 1896. Grace had written down several large payments made by Daniel to someone only identified as J.C. The amounts were huge, way beyond what would be expected for legal services or even. For example, the dates of these transactions were close to the times when the merchant had gone missing. McBride couldn't prove it, but he was very sure that J.C. Wack was the employee Grace had heard talking to Daniel about solving problems. The loaded pistol in the hiding place also told its own story. Grace clearly lived in real fear that Daniel would find it and use it against her as a last resort, hoping that he would show up and silence her for good. The gun was in the hiding place and not in an easier-to-reach spot in the house. This suggested that Grace had put it there before she disappeared, possibly because she thought she would have to leave her house quickly and not have time to get it back. McBride also found something in the hiding place that seemed unimportant at first but turned out to be very important. A small, silver locket with a picture of an older woman who looked a lot like Grace. It was a locket that said, "To my dear daughter, with eternal love, Mother." During previous investigations, the sheriff learned that Grace's mother had died when she was only 16. This locket was clearly one of her most valuable possessions, and she would never leave it behind unless she had to. With this new information, McBride completely changed his understanding of the case. Grace wasn't just a woman running away from an abusive husband. She knew a lot about serious crimes, maybe even murder, and had carefully written down what she knew. The hiding place was her insurance policy evidence she could use if she needed to get protection or prove her innocence. The fact that she left it behind when she disappeared suggested that her departure from Valor Cruise was sudden and unplanned. The sheriff started to piece together what happened in October 1899. With this new information, Daniel Hargrove, secretly David Harrison, tracked Grace to Valerie. Cruise after months or even years of searching. He had camped in the nearby woods, watching her and planning his approach. The letters he had written and then partially burned showed that he had first tried to get her to come back or work out a deal. When she refused, he took more direct action. On the night of October 7th, Daniel confronted Grace at her cabin. The fight that had broken out in the house was her attempt to fight back. He had restrained her, possibly using violence or threats, and forced her to go to bed. She agreed to go with him, and they went to Asheville, where the merchant saw them. Signing up at the hotel as a couple did not mean they were getting back together. It meant they were being forced to. Daniel was taking Grace somewhere, probably to get her to tell him about the last pieces of evidence against him, or to sign papers that would clear him. But something happened between Asheville and Atlanta. Grace had gotten away from Daniel during the train ride or at some stop along the way, or things had changed drastically. The fact that she showed up alone in Atlanta, scared and wary, suggested she had gotten away from Daniel. But she wasn't sure he wouldn't come after her again. Her strange behavior, the job interviews she turned down, and the constant surveillance through the boarding house window all pointed to a woman on the run. McBride thought about a possibility he had first thought of in Atlanta that became more likely with the new evidence. Grace could have used her. Daniel was taking her against her will, possibly to permanently silence her. She had the knowledge, the motivation, and the chance to do something about it. She might have thought that her only chance of survival was to act first. The preparations she kept in her cabin, some of which the apothecary had warned could be lethal in concentrated doses, could have gone with her. It would have been easy to add them to Daniel's bag. Something to Daniel's food or drink while he wasn't paying attention. The idea that Grace might have killed Daniel Harrow put McBride in a tough moral and legal spot. On the one hand, she would be legally guilty of murder if she had killed her husband, even if she did it in self-defense or extreme duress. On the other hand, the evidence he had showed that she was a victim who had been abused for years and had found out about her husband's serious illness. People at the time had strict laws about who could do what crimes and who could be chased across multiple states by a clearly dangerous man. But McBride cared more about justice than the letter of the law. He needed to find Grace to not only figure out what happened, but also to solve the mystery of her disappearance. The sheriff decided to search outside of Georgia because if Grace was on the run, she wouldn't stay in Atlanta for long. Daniel, or the police, if she did something illegal, or Daniel if he was still alive, would always be one step ahead of her. McBride sent telegrams to sheriffs in Alabama, Tennessee, Mississippi, and even Louisiana and Texas. He gave them detailed descriptions and told them about using aliases like Margaret Thornton. He also asked them to look into any single women who had recently moved to their areas looking for work as housekeepers or... In the summer of 1900, responses started coming in, but they were frustratingly general. Several sheriffs reported women who might fit the description, but when specifics were checked, the similarities were found to be superficial. At that time, there were thousands of women traveling alone across the southern United States, many of them widowed or separated and looking to start over. It was nearly impossible to pick out a specific person in this sea of moving people. McBride was interested when he heard back from the sheriff of Mobile, Alabama, a port city on the Gulf of Mexico. He said that a woman fitting the description had worked briefly as an assistant in a medical clinic in December 1899. She had used the name Mary Thornton, which was close enough to her other names to be suspicious. The doctor who had hired her, Dr. Samuel Blackwell, remembered her well because she had impressed him with her knowledge of herbal treatments and her kindness. It had only been 3 weeks since she quit her job because of a family emergency up north. McBride went to Mobile in September, which was another long and tiring trip that took almost 2 weeks of train and boat connections. The port city was busy and cosmopolitan, a gateway to Gulf trade, and home to a diverse population of merchants, sailors, immigrants, and adventurers of all kinds. It was a place where someone wanting to disappear could do so with ease. Dr. Blackwell welcomed McBride into his clinic, which was small but clean and mostly served dock workers and their families. Blackwell was a middle-aged man with a gentle demeanor and a sharp eye. He confirmed that he had hired a woman named Mary Thornton in late 1899 and that she had shown amazing skill for someone who hadn't had formal medical training. She knew about medicinal plants he didn't know about and made tinctures and picuses with them. When McBride showed him a picture of Grace and Daniel on their wedding day, Blackwell carefully looked at it and confirmed that the woman in it was definitely his former assistant. She had looked thinner and more stressed when she worked for him, but the doctor also said something strange that he had noticed at the time. Mary always wore long sleeves, even when it was sweltering outside, and he had seen her reach for supplies that they were always on the wrong side. On a high shelf, there were marks around her wrists that looked like she had just been bound. When he asked her about the marks, she quickly pulled down her sleeve and changed the subject. Blackwell also said that Mary had asked about ships leaving from Mobile for faraway places. She was especially interested in ships going to the Caribbean, Mexico, or even South America. The doctor thought she was thinking about taking a trip to deal with the family emergency she had mentioned. Now that he thought about how she usually behaved, he wondered if she was actually planning an even farther away escape. The sheriff spent days in Mobile looking into shipping records for ships that left in late December 1899 and early January 1900. It was boring work going through shipping company offices, talking to captains and officers, and looking at handwritten passenger lists that were often missing or hard to read. He found several women traveling alone listed under different names, but none of them were definitely Grace. When McBride was at a bar with a lot of sailors, he was talking to a retired captain named Jeremiah Stone. The old captain told McBride about a strange event that happened last December. Stone was in charge of a freighter that usually went between Mobile, Alabama, and Veracruz, Mexico, carrying mostly cotton and manufactured goods. On this trip, however, a woman showed up at the dock offering a lot of money to go with them. She didn't have the right papers and clearly wanted to avoid going through official shipping channels. Stone said that he normally would have turned down such a request, but something about the woman's desperate need had moved him. She didn't seem like a normal criminal, but rather someone running away from danger, so he agreed to take her, writing her name as M. Tass in the ship's books instead of her full name. The trip to Veracruz took 5 days, and during that time, the woman. She had stayed in the small cabin he had set up for her and only came out for quick meals, which she ate by herself. Captain Stone remembered a short conversation he had with the mysterious passenger the night before they got to Mexico. She had thanked him for being kind and said she was planning to go deeper into Mexico, maybe even crossing into one of the Central American countries where she could start over. When Stone asked her carefully if she was in any kind of legal trouble, she said she wasn't. In order to avoid trouble, she told Stone that she was running away from something that the court would not understand, and that she needed to put as much distance as possible between herself and her past. Stone didn't ask any more questions because sailors learn to respect other people's secrets, and he thought the woman deserved a chance to rebuild her life no matter what. When they arrived in Veracruz on December 28, 1899, she quickly got off the ship with only her small suitcase. Stone never found out what happened to her after that. McBride was both relieved and frustrated. He was sure the mysterious passenger was Grace Hargrove. The timing was perfect, and the woman's calm demeanor and desire to run away were exactly what you'd expect from someone in her situation. But now she was in Mexico, possibly even further away, in territory that was not under his control, and he was having trouble tracking her. The sheriff thought about his options. He could try to get in touch with Mexican authorities, but he knew that international cooperation in these kinds of cases was slow, bureaucratic, and often ineffective, especially when no criminal charges were filed. He could also just close the case as an unsolved disappearance, which would have been fine, but something was really bothering him. Daniel Hargrove's question about where he was remained unanswered. If Grace had been there, where was he? What had happened to the man who had been chasing her so obsessively? McBride decided to look at the problem from a different angle. If he couldn't find Grace, maybe he could find Daniel, or at least find out what had happened to him. The sheriff focused on the time between Asheville and Atlanta, which was clearly a key time when something important happened. He went back to North Carolina and this time focused on the towns and villages along the railroad route that connected Asheville to Atlanta. At each stop, McBride talked to station workers, hotel and boarding house owners, local merchants, and anyone else who might have seen the couple traveling together in October 1899. Most of them couldn't remember anything specific because it had been almost a year and thousands of travelers had been on these routes. But in a small town called Toccoa, Georgia, he finally found something. The owner of a simple hotel in Toccoa, a man of German descent named Heinrich Mueller, had an amazing memory for faces and strange details. When McBride showed him the couple's description and photo, Mueller looked at them carefully and slowly nodded. He remembered a couple that looked just like them staying at his hotel for 2 nights in the middle of October of the previous year. What made their stay memorable wasn't how they looked, but how tense the relationship between them was. Mueller said that the man had registered with a name the hotelier couldn't remember exactly. A woman named Harrison or Henderson had been staring at the floor and keeping quiet the whole time. Mueller noticed that she looked tired and upset. When they got to the room, the man held her arm tightly in a way that didn't seem affectionate or controlling. The hotelier said he felt uncomfortable with the situation, but in those days, it was common for couples to have their own problems, and he didn't think it was right to get involved. Other guests had complained about the couple's room having loud voices, so Mueller went upstairs to ask them to be quiet. As he walked up to the door, he could clearly hear an intense argument. The man's voice was low and threatening, demanding that Grace tell him where the rest of the evidence she had against him was. Her voice went back and forth between pleading and firm determination, telling him that he would never find what he was looking for. When Mueller knocked on the door, there was silence. He opened it just a few inches, told her everything was okay and that nothing else would happen, and then closed it again before Mueller could get a good look inside. The next day, Mueller saw that the woman had a red mark on her neck that looked like someone had grabbed her throat. She was wearing a scarf to try to hide it, but when she bent over to pick up something, she dropped. The scarf came off, and the mark showed. The man wouldn't leave her alone for even a moment, even going with her to the hotel's public bathrooms when she needed to. Mueller found this very disturbing, but he didn't want to get involved in the affairs of what seemed to be a married couple. On the second night of their stay, something dramatic happened. Around 10 o'clock, Mueller was closing the main hall when he heard the sound of something heavy falling upstairs, followed by a long silence that seemed to carry its own weight. He waited a few minutes, hoping to hear something. He went upstairs and knocked on the couple's bedroom door, afraid that someone might have been hurt. There was no answer, so he knocked again, louder, and said that he was the owner. Finally, he heard movement inside and shuffled footsteps coming toward the door. When the door opened, Mueller saw the woman by herself. She looked shaken, her breathing fast, and her eyes wide with a mix of fear and determination. Her hands were shaking. She told him that everything was fine, and that she had just dropped a heavy suitcase from the top of the closet. She also said that her husband had gone outside for some fresh air and a short walk around town. Mueller didn't believe her story completely. He tried to look past her into the room, but she blocked his view by strategically positioning herself in the doorway. When he asked her if she was sure that everything was okay, she was firm, almost aggressive, in her assurance that she didn't need any help. They went back downstairs and listened for any more noises. The rest of the night was very quiet, which was unsettling. Around 7 o'clock in the morning, the woman came downstairs by herself with her small suitcase. She paid the couple's bill in full, placing the coins and bills on the counter with hands that were still shaking a little. She said that her husband had left very early for important business in the next city, and that she would meet him later at the train station. She seemed strange. She avoided making eye contact with Muller because she was nervous. When he tried to make small talk by asking where they were going, she gave a vague and contradictory answer, first saying Atlanta and then changing her mind to say they were going somewhere else. Muller noticed that she was wearing a different dress than the day before and that some of her clothes seemed a little damp, like she had washed something quickly and put them on before they were completely dry. He couldn't quite put his finger on it, but it smelled like strong medicinal herbs mixed with something chemical. She quickly left the hotel, looking back several times as she did so, as if she thought she was being followed or was afraid that something or someone would come out from behind her. What interested Muller the most, and the reason he remembered the event so clearly almost a year later, was what he found when he cleaned the room after the event. The room was spotless, cleaner than most guests had left it. The sheets on the bed had been changed, but Muller didn't provide clean sheets for daily changes. When he checked the laundry basket in the hallway, he saw the original sheets rolled up at the bottom, and they were clearly wet, as if they had been washed very hard overnight. What was even scarier was that when Muller moved the bed to sweep under it, he found a small amount of white powder scattered across the hardwood floor, as if someone had. Someone dropped something and quickly tried to clean it up, but they couldn't get under the heavy bed frame. There were also faint but noticeable drag marks on the floor, like something heavy had been moved from the middle of the room to the window. Muller had brushed the information off his chest at the time, but now, months later, in front of the sheriff, he was feeling more and more uneasy about what the substance might have been and what the drag marks meant. He got a chill when he heard these descriptions. He asked Mueller if he had saved any samples of the powder, but the hotelier said he had just swept it up and thrown it away with the trash the next day. This was a big loss of possible evidence, but McBride was sure he knew what had happened in that room. Grace, who knew a lot about plants and medicines, had made something from her secret stash and given it to Daniel during that time. The second night, he probably mixed it into his drink or food when he wasn't paying attention. The sound of something heavy falling that Muller had heard was Daniel giving up and collapsing to the floor. The sheriff pressed Muller for more important information. What floor was the couple's room on? Mayer told Muller that it was on the second floor and that the window faced the back of the hotel, where a small narrow alley led to a wooded area at the property's edge. It was a pretty private spot, especially at night. At night, when most stores on the street were closed, McBride asked to look at the room right away, even though he knew it had been used by dozens of guests since then. Machler showed him to the room, which was simple and useful, with an iron bed, a small table, a wooden chair, and a porcelain sink for washing. McBride carefully looked at every inch, moving furniture, checking the walls for cracks, and moving the heavy cabinet. He looked in the dusty wall and cabinet and found something that made his heart race, a small dark glass vial that was empty but had a layer of dried crystallized liquid on the bottom. This was the exact type of vial that herbalists used for making concentrated tinctures of medicinal plants. He carefully stored it by wrapping it in his own handkerchief to keep it safe. McBride then looked out the bedroom window. It was wide open, and when he leaned out, he saw that the drop to the alley floor below was about 4 meters. It wasn't a drop. That would hurt a lot of people, but it would definitely kill someone. He went down into the alley and started looking for signs of something strange. The ground was packed dirt with a few rocks here and there and plants growing along the edges. He was about to give up when he noticed something strange. Near the hotel wall, there was an area where the ground looked like it had been disturbed at some point. The plants there were. It looked like the soil had been turned over and then left to recover naturally. McBride carefully dug through the layers of dirt and found fabric about a foot down. His heart started racing, so he dug even faster, and soon found a large piece of a dark-coated man's overcoat, the kind that a wealthy man might wear for traveling. The fabric was stained and worn from being in the ground for a long time, but it was still recognizable. There were other pieces of fabric scattered around, pieces of clothing that clearly belonged to the same set. McBride stopped digging and sent an urgent telegram to state officials asking them to send the right team to do a thorough and careful excavation of the site. He knew he had found something very important, but he needed professional help to move forward. For the next 3 days, while waiting for the team to arrive, he continued his investigation in Toccoa by talking to residents, business owners, and anyone else who might have seen what he had seen. Something strange happened that October night last year. A coachman who worked near the hotel remembered seeing a woman leaving the back of the hotel alone with something heavy wrapped in dark cloth. He thought it was strange at the time, especially since it was so late at night, but he didn't say anything because she quickly disappeared into the darkness of the alley. Someone who lived in a house next to the hotel said they heard digging sounds coming from the alley in the early hours of the morning, but thought it might have been animals or someone from the hotel doing some kind of maintenance. When the specialized team from Atlanta finally arrived, they dug the site up carefully and methodically. What they found confirmed McBride's worst fears and raised more questions. Along with the men's clothes, they found an empty leather wallet, a broken pocket watch, and human bone fragments deeper in the ground. It wasn't a full body by any means, but it was. There was clear proof that something terrible had happened there. An expert in anatomy said the bones belonged to a strong adult male, but there weren't enough of them to make a full body. This led to many theories. Maybe Grace had just buried some of Daniel's things there to confuse investigators while getting rid of the body in another way. Or maybe, in her haste and panic that night, she had committed murder. They were only able to bury parts of Daniel Harrow because they didn't have time to bury the rest and were afraid of being found. Over the next few weeks, McBride tried to find Daniel Harrow's whereabouts after October 1899. He sent telegrams to hundreds of jurisdictions, gave detailed descriptions, checked death records, talked to hospitals and nursing homes, and looked into any possible sightings. Nothing. Daniel Harrow had disappeared after that night in Toccoa. There were no records of his presence anywhere. Real or fake names, no money transfers, and no letters. It was like he had disappeared. The search for Grace continued, but with the same frustrating results. Once she left Mobile for Mexico, the trail went cold. Captain Jeremiah Stone, who had taken her to Veracruz, was the last person to say that he had seen her. McBride tried to work with Mexican authorities, but they wouldn't cooperate, and language and bureaucratic barriers made the investigation nearly impossible. Mexico was very big, and a woman who wanted to disappear could do so easily if she had the money, which Grace must have had from the savings she kept hidden. In November 1900, McBride got a letter from a lawyer in New Orleans, Louisiana, telling him that she had been contacted by a woman saying she was the heir to Grace Hargrove's property in Valor Cruz. The woman, who had not given her full name, had not given him any other information about herself. Name had sent what seemed to be real proof that she was Grace and asked that the property be sold, and the money sent to an address in the Mexico City. McBride went to New Orleans right away to meet the lawyer, an old and careful man named Ezra Beaumont. Beaumont showed the sheriff the letters and documents he had received. The handwriting exactly matched Grace's, according to the diaries and letters McBride had looked at. The documents had information about It was clear that Grace Hargrove was still alive and living in Mexico. Beaumont also said that the woman had included a sealed letter addressed to Watauga County Sheriff William McBride. as if she knew he would eventually find out about the real estate deal. The lawyer gave the sealed envelope to McBride, who opened it with trembling hands. The letter was long and detailed, written in the same beautiful handwriting he had used for the paperwork. Grace started by thanking McBride for his hard work and persistence in the investigation, showing that she knew he had been following her for months. She then told her version of what happened in October 1899, which was both a confession and an explanation. Grace wrote that Daniel had met her in Valor Creuse and threatened to kill her if she didn't go with him. He planned to take her to a remote place where he could get information from her about the murder. During the trip, he went back and forth between trying to convince her with promises of reconciliation and threatening to hurt her if she didn't give in. On her second night in Tocoa, Grace wrote that she had made the hardest decision of her life. She had made a mixture with the few drugs she had been able to hide that would put her to sleep, and Daniel took the drug in a tea that Grace had made for them both, while telling them they needed to calm down and talk things through. Daniel, thinking he was in charge, accepted the drink. Within 20 minutes, he started to feel the effects. Within an hour, he was unconscious. Within 3 hours, his heart had stopped beating. Grace talked in surprisingly clinical terms about how she had checked several times that he was dead and how she had fought panic. She felt shame and horror at what she had done, and then, out of survival instinct, she started trying to erase evidence of what had happened. She cleaned the floor, changed the sheets, and washed anything that might have been contaminated with the substance. But moving the body was impossible because she wasn't strong enough to do it herself, and she knew that trying to leave the hotel with it would be crazy. That's when she made a desperate and horrible choice. With the small knife she carried for safety, she took some of Daniel's things and clothes off. In the dark before dawn, she threw some of the most recognizable items out the window, along with smaller pieces she could quickly separate and bury in the alley behind the hotel. She also admitted in the letter that she had left the rest of Daniel's things in the room, wrapped in a rug and hidden under the bed, hoping no one would find them right away. She had planned to come back to deal with it later. It was done right, but she was scared, so she ran away. First to Atlanta, then to Mobile, and finally to Mexico. In the letter, Grace didn't ask for forgiveness or say she felt bad about Daniel's death. Instead, she said she had done what she had to do to stay alive, that Daniel would have killed her right away, and that she had just done what she had to do. She pointed to the years of emotional abuse, the constant threats, and the fact that she knew he was involved in serious crimes, possibly murder. In the letter, Grace said that she had built a new life in Mexico and was helping poor communities with her knowledge of herbal medicine. She also said that as a woman, she didn't have enough legal options, and that the only way to get justice was to do it herself. At the end of the letter, Grace asked McBride to stop pursuing her, saying that she had finally found peace after years of terror, and that bringing the case to court would only make things worse. Daniel had lied to powerful people to get things he wanted, and her last words were a simple plea. "Let the dead rest, Sheriff, and give the living a chance to begin again." McBride read the letter 3 times, and each time he felt conflicted. As a police officer, he had a duty to seek justice, to bring criminals to justice, and to make sure that murders did not go unpunished no matter what. But as a person, as a man who had spent months investigating, he felt like he had to let the dead rest. When he looked into the case and read the documents and testimonies that showed how Grace and Daniel were dating, he felt something different. He saw a woman who had been a victim for years, who had found out about serious crimes, who had lived under constant threat, and who had finally, when she was literally between life and death, made the choice to survive. In the months that followed, McBride struggled with his conscience. He wrote an official report on the case that included everything he had found, but he left out some things. He said that Grace Harrove's disappearance was still an unsolved case, and that the remains found in Tocoa could not be positively identified with the tools and technology available at the time. He also said that both Grace and Daniel had probably died in unknown ways that were connected to their troubled pasts. The case remained open, but did not move forward. Grace's valet Cruzy's estate was eventually sold through her New Orleans lawyer, and the money was sent to her as she asked, and McBride kept her personal letter in a sealed envelope in his private files with instructions that it should only be opened after his death. He never told anyone what was in the letter while he was alive. Years went by, and McBride eventually retired as sheriff. He spent his last years peacefully on the small mountain farm he loved so much. When he died in 1923, his son found the letter among his personal papers, read it with shock, and decided to deposit it. It is still kept in the county historical archives as a reminder of a time when justice wasn't always found in courts, but in the impossible choices that desperate people had to make. As for Grace Hargrove, no one ever found out for sure what happened to her. Over the years, rumors spread of an American healer working in remote Mexican villages, of a woman who knew more about plants than anyone else and helped the poor for free. She had done what she set out to do disappear completely. In her wake, she left only questions and a story that couldn't be put into simple categories like victim or villain, innocent or guilty. The Grace Hargrove case is still kept in the Wada County Archives as one of the most disturbing and morally complex mysteries in Appalachian history. It's not a story with a happy ending or easy answers. It's a grim reminder that sometimes the line between justice and revenge, it can be hard to tell the difference between self-defense and murder, between victim and perpetrator. And now, more than 100 years later, we can only think about the impossible choices Grace had to make, the desperate choices she made, and the terrible price she paid for her freedom. Her story doesn't give us clear answers, but it does make us think about what we would do if we were stuck between survival and morality, between law and justice, or between what is legal and what isn't. If you made it this far in this trip through one of the darkest times in Appalachian history, thank you very much for watching. These kinds of stories should be told not to glorify violence or celebrate tragedy, but to remind us that behind every cold case, every dusty record, and every unsolved mystery are real, complicated lives full of pain and hope, mistakes and redemption. If you liked this look into the disturbing past, please consider subscribing to the channel for more stories like this. Explore the forgotten and dark parts of history. Tell us what you think about Grace Hargrove's case, the decisions she made, and what justice is like when the system fails. Also, share this video with someone who likes true stories that are mysterious and have moral complexities. Until next time, explore the shadows of history.